It's a battle of metal in this, the Apple iPhone 6 versus the HTC One M8. Metal is the order of the day with both of these smartphones, as both feature a premium build with a design that is actually quite comparable, at least from the back. The iPhone 6 has more of a curve to it, especially on the sides, though the front and back will remain pretty flat, aside from that small protrusion of the camera sticking out. The M8 refines what was great about the One M7, using a lot more metal this time around, but it does have a little bit more of a curve along the edges on its own. Up front is where the differences are more obvious. Apple continues its signature style with the physical home button that now has a fingerprint scanner integrated and somewhat bigger bezels. HTC does away with capacitive keys, but the black bar is still found under the display. But, of course, there are the very welcome and now signature boom sound speakers. The iPhone 6 is finally catching up to Android devices in terms of display size, and that translates to the comparison in overall dimensions, but the M8 is still obviously the larger device, definitely thicker and definitely heavier. But the handling experience might be somewhat similar on both, as the metal back might prove to be slippery and is a problem for both of these devices. But for Android users, they've already been used to devices of this size, so iPhone loyalists switching to the 6 may require a little bit of time getting used to the bigger build. And of course, the big news this year is about Apple finally giving into the bigger screens. The iPhone 6 comes with a 4.7-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution that Apple calls Retina HD, but basically comes in at 1334 by 750 resolution. The One M8, on the other hand, has an SLCD screen at 5 inches with a 1080p resolution and a pixel count of 441 ppi over the 326 of the iPhone 6. Both displays are great performers with good colors and contrast and pretty great viewing angles. And while the advantages of having a pixel density above 300 ppi is still debated, the difference between the two is somewhat noticeable with a closer look, but overall the general user may not really notice the difference. It's basically a battle of Android and iOS here, as comparing two very different types of processors isn't necessarily too fair in this comparison. But for the record, the iPhone 6 comes with a all-new A8 chip that is made in-house and is a dual-core processor clocked in at 1.4 GHz and is backed by 1 GB of RAM. On the other hand, the One M8 boasts a quad-core Snapdragon 801 clocked in at 2.3 GHz along with 2 GB of RAM. But regardless of the differences on paper, both handle their respective softwares very well, with no issues with lag across the board and both handling multitasking very well. Sense UI in particular does get a nod because it is one of the more minimalistic Android iterations that are available and is a better rival somewhat to the iOS that has always been a pretty good performer on iPhone devices. When it comes to other hardware, the iPhone 6 is the first, along with the 6 Plus, to feature NFC, though it will only be used for Apple Pay at least for now. The One M8 also has NFC, but it isn't new and can be used with plenty of other features. The One M8 does have the additional benefit of expandable storage on top of its 16 or 32 GB of internal storage, and there is no micro SD expansion with the iPhone, but it does come in a 128 GB flavor for those concerned about storage. Both of these phones stay away from the megapixel race, as the iPhone 6 features an 8 megapixel rear shooter, the same as its predecessor, with some improvements across the board, including focus pixels, which is basically a phase detection autofocus, but also a more open aperture and also software-based image stabilization. Video capture also gets a boost as well, with the capability of capturing 240 frames per second slow motion at 720p resolution. And on the other hand, the One M8 is even more megapixel shy, as it brings back its 4 ultra pixels from the One M7. Added in, however, on the back is a secondary camera, the Duo camera, that helps get depth data in order for you to create depth of field shots. Low light photography will be better on the One M8, but that low megapixel count kind of evens out the playing field a little bit. And finally, in software, as I mentioned before, the Sense UI is one of the more minimalistic versions of Android that is available, but it still comes with quite a few of its own features. One in particular is the Blink feed, which is a secondary screen that brings you an aggregated list of news websites, social media feeds, all in a very easy to use and very attractive format. It does run Android 4.4 KitKat, and this is Sense 6 we're talking about. And after that, we do have the added benefit of some gesture control, such as the tap to wake and the ability to answer a call just by raising the phone to your ear. iOS 8, on the other hand, has had a major update. It's not necessarily the big aesthetic overhaul that iOS 7 was, but it does introduce some new features, like for example continuity, which allows you to have syncing across a lot of different Apple products, but you can also have the health application, which is actually quite robust. Apple Pay is here now to take advantage of the NFC chip, though it does make the NFC chip only used for it. The aesthetics of the OS, however, such as the color scheme, remain largely unchanged from iOS 7. And so there you have it for this battle of the metal phones. We have the Apple iPhone 6 versus the HTC One M8. People will pretty much argue that a aluminum design usually makes the phone a little bit better, and in that case, both of these phones are probably going to be the choices for those particular people. As far as features go, they do have pretty similar feature sets, but the resolution of the One M8 might be a little bit better for you, even though the bump up in resolution for the iPhone 6 is definitely welcome for iPhone loyalists. Stay tuned to Android Authority for even more comparisons as we take a look at the competition, the Apple iPhone 6 and 6 Plus versus the competition of the Android's flagships here at Android Authority, because we are your source for all things Android.